Dawn, late 1940. Off the cold coastline of Britain, a weak tide retreats and exposes something half buried in the sand, metallic, smooth, and strangely intact. American naval observers, stationed overseas long before their country officially entered the war, watch in silence as British disposal teams approach the object. Nobody speaks at first. The air carries that kind of quiet you only feel when you sense danger but don't yet understand it. What they uncover isn't just another German mine. It's a shape the British had never seen before, sleek, almost minimalist, with no horns, no obvious detonators. Just a sealed steel casing and a set of components hidden inside. A silent weapon, sitting in the open as if waiting to be found. For months, Allied ships have been exploding without warning. No contact, no visual trigger, no pattern. The losses came suddenly, almost mockingly. Vessels anchored in calm harbors, trawlers moving slowly along familiar routes, destroyers maneuvering with precision. All of them struck below the waterline by something no one could explain. The U.S. Navy, still years behind in magnetic mine technology, had theories, guesses, really. Some officers believed the Germans were experimenting with a new kind of proximity device. Others thought it was sabotage or delayed action charges hidden in cargo. But nothing matched the evidence. Ships were being destroyed by forces they couldn't detect, measure, or predict. When the British engineers lift the mine onto a flatbed, the American observers finally get their first clear look. It's elegant in a way that makes engineers nervous, the elegance of something refined, optimized, built with absolute purpose. And it carries a quiet threat, because anything this clean and this deliberate usually comes from a long chain of research and testing. In Washington, the reports start arriving the next morning. Words like unknown mechanism, suspected magnetic influence, and unexplained triggering appear in cables that spread across the desks of Navy officers who know exactly what those phrases imply. A technological leap has been made somewhere, and it wasn't made by them. The truth, at this point, is simple and frightening. The United States does not understand this weapon. They don't know how it works, how to detect it, or how to counter it. And worse, they have no idea how far the Germans have taken the science behind it. What came next wasn't just a technical investigation. It was a race, a contest of engineering cultures, and a moment when the U.S. Navy realized it could no longer assume its own industrial superiority. This mine, this silent object dragged from a British beach, would force the United States to rethink everything it believed about naval warfare. The mine recovered on that quiet shoreline didn't just confirm Allied suspicions, it opened a door into a completely new type of naval warfare. Until then, most American officers still thought in terms of contact mines, devices that required a ship's hull to physically strike a trigger. Crude, predictable, and visible. But this German weapon operated on a principle far more abstract and far more dangerous: the magnetic signature of a ship. Every steel hull carries a magnetic field. It's subtle, but consistent, an invisible fingerprint created by the Earth's magnetism and by the stresses of construction. German engineers had found a way to measure that field and weaponize it. The mine didn't wait for a collision. It waited for a shift in magnetic intensity strong enough to indicate a vessel of significant size passing overhead. When that threshold was reached, the firing mechanism armed itself and released a charge directly beneath the keel. The result was devastating, a column of water and pressure rising upward with enough force to break a ship's back. In Washington, the early technical reports read like warnings from another world. American engineers knew the theory. Magnetic influence devices had been discussed in naval circles since the late 1920s, but the practical engineering required was immense. Precise coils, calibrated sensitivity, reliable arming delays, stable casings, and intricate anti-tamper systems. The Germans had solved all of them. The U.S. Navy, suddenly aware of the gap, struggled with two simultaneous questions. How does it work? And more urgently, how do we protect our ships before more of them are lost? At the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, scientists and officers gathered around chalkboards filled with sketches and speculative diagrams. Some focused on the physics: how fast a magnetic field changes when a ship passes overhead, how the mine's internal coil might read that shift, how the firing threshold could be set. Others focused on countermeasures. Early ideas ranged from the impractical, coating hulls with non-magnetic materials, to the desperate, towing large degaussing loops behind ships to artificially distort their magnetic signatures. But these were still guesses. Without access to the internals of the recovered mine, every solution was theoretical, and time was not on their side. Meanwhile, cables arriving from the North Atlantic painted an increasingly grim picture. Merchant vessels, vital for the British war effort and crucial to American supply commitments, were disappearing in sudden bursts of water. Harbors assumed to be safe zones now held quiet, restrained fear. The enemy had introduced a weapon that followed no rules, no visible placement, no predictable pattern. It punished ignorance. American officers realized something else as well. If the Germans had deployed magnetic mines this early in the war, they likely had more advanced variants already in development. In conference rooms filled with tension and hurried handwriting, one phrase appeared repeatedly. "We are facing a weapon we cannot see, cannot detect, and cannot neutralize." But that was about to change. Because the mine found in Britain wasn't just intact, it was recoverable. And deep inside its sealed casing waited answers, if American and British engineers could survive the process of opening it. What followed next was one of the most delicate and dangerous technical dissections ever attempted during the war. The recovered mine was transported to a secured British facility under conditions that felt closer to a surgical operation than an engineering task. Every movement was slow. Every sound seemed louder than it should be. And for good reason. German magnetic mines were known to hold anti-handling devices, booby traps deliberately built to kill anyone who tried to study them. American observers, standing just behind the British engineers, watched as the mine was placed on a padded examination cradle. The casing was surprisingly smooth, almost polished, with markings that offered no easy clues. No serials. No diagrams. Nothing to help. Just a silent shell of steel that could still be alive. The first step was to neutralize any residual magnetic trigger. Large wooden frames were brought in, fitted with rubber and non-magnetic tools. Every metal object in the room was removed, even wedding rings and pocket knives. A single incorrect vibration or a stray magnetic pulse could detonate the device. Before any cutting began, engineers circled the mine with handheld magnetometers, simple, almost primitive devices compared to the weapon they were facing. The readings were faint but steady, indicating the internal firing mechanism was still armed. That meant two things: the main charge remained intact, and the influence coil was still capable of reacting to the environment. The room quieted. Nobody wanted to breathe too loudly. Disarming began with a slow, methodical removal of the tail section. Wooden clamps held the casing steady while non-sparking brass tools loosened tiny, counterintuitive screws. German engineers had a reputation for designing ordnance with unexpected geometries, fastening patterns that seemed to have no logic except to confuse anyone attempting to reach the internals. After nearly an hour, the rear panel came free with a soft, metallic sigh. Inside lay the first unmistakable clue: a series of delicate copper coils arranged around a small glass ampoule. The American officers leaned forward. This was it, the magnetic influence system. A sensor designed to read changes in a ship's magnetic field with remarkable precision. But the engineers froze. Under the coils, partly hidden, was a thin, spring-loaded plate. One wrong movement and the plate could trigger a secondary detonator. An anti-handling device. Removing it required absolute coordination. Two engineers stabilized the frame while a third eased the tension on the plate with a hand-carved wooden wedge. The entire room held its breath for 5 unbroken seconds, until the tension finally released without a sound. Only then did they remove the influence coil assembly. It was both simple and sophisticated, a compact, sensitive induction device capable of interpreting magnetic gradients. The threshold was adjustable, and the Germans had set it just high enough to filter small boats and debris. This mine had been calibrated specifically for large steel ships, destroyers, cruisers, tankers. The American observers were stunned. This wasn't a prototype. This was a mature, battlefield-ready weapon. As the examination continued, new components emerged, delayed action switches, safety clocks, and a battery system far more stable than anything the U.S. Navy had in service. Every part spoke of a research program that had been evolving for years, perhaps decades. When the final section was opened and the explosive charge made safe, the lead British engineer stepped back, exhausted. Then he looked toward the Americans and said what everyone was already thinking. "Gentlemen, they're ahead of us. Far ahead." That night, cables were sent across the Atlantic with urgency bordering on alarm. For the first time in the war, U.S. Navy leadership knew they were facing a threat that was not only invisible, but built on scientific principles they had underestimated. The race to counter the silent weapon had officially begun. By early 1941, the detailed reports from Britain reached Washington with a clarity that left no room for denial. The German magnetic mine was no experimental curiosity. It was a fully engineered, fully deployed strategic weapon, and the United States Navy had no defense against it. Meetings at the Bureau of Ships grew more urgent. Charts of the Atlantic filled entire walls, shipping lanes, convoy paths, harbor approaches. Red pins indicated recent losses, and every week there were more of them. Some ships sank at anchor, others while maneuvering slowly through narrow channels. A few disappeared without even transmitting a distress call. What unsettled American officers wasn't just the casualty reports, it was the pattern. The mines were doing exactly what they were designed to do: punish predictability. Anywhere ships slowed down, gathered, or followed routine, the mines waited in silence. It became clear that the U.S. Navy faced two simultaneous crises. First, understanding the physics and engineering behind a weapon they had barely studied. Second, protecting every American ship already deployed in the Atlantic. The first crisis demanded laboratories, time, and specialists. The second demanded action, immediately. Across naval bases from Norfolk to Boston, commanders began implementing improvised measures. Some were based on reasonable theory, others were born from desperation. Ships were ordered to vary their routes entering and leaving port. Tugs dragged makeshift magnetic sweeps, cables pulsing with electric current, through channels in an attempt to trigger mines prematurely. Some captains even experimented with changing engine RPMs in shallow waters, hoping vibration might reduce magnetic buildup. None of it was reliable. In closed-door discussions, a hard truth emerged: the United States needed to rethink magnetic signatures entirely. Every large steel ship carried a natural magnetic field, shaped by the Earth and by the stresses locked into the hull during construction. Without intervention, that field made them perfect targets. The idea of degaussing, reducing, or altering a ship's magnetic footprint had existed in theory, but only in theory. A few small coils had been tested on patrol craft years earlier, with inconsistent results. No one had tried implementing it on a global scale, across an entire navy. Now, there was no choice. The recovered German mine had shown that the enemy's engineering was not just competent, it was precise, stable, and widely deployed. The U.S. needed a countermeasure that was just as reliable. In late-night brainstorming sessions, engineers sketched solutions that looked more like science fiction than naval practice. Loops of cable wrapped around hulls, complex electric current patterns to cancel out magnetic fields, portable calibration devices to measure each ship's unique signature. Every hull would need its own tailored solution. There was no universal fix. The scale of such an effort would be enormous. Thousands of feet of copper cable, specialized generators, new fastening systems, dockyard time, trained technicians, and a fresh set of operational procedures. Installing coils on even one cruiser could take days. Doing this across the entire Atlantic fleet would require a miracle, or something close to it. But the alternative was unacceptable. Reports from the North Atlantic made that painfully clear. Escort ships arriving at British ports often found themselves guiding convoys through waters littered with debris from recent sinkings. Survivors pulled from rafts described the same sensation again and again: a sudden, deep concussion from below, the kind that lifted a ship before tearing it apart. No warning, no contact, just a silent flash beneath the surface. American officers realized that unless they acted fast, This invisible weapon would carve holes in their logistical lifelines long before the U.S. formally entered the war. The pressure was immense. And inside the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, teams had already begun dissecting the German coils, studying every copper winding, every screw, every calibration dial. Understanding the weapon was no longer enough. Now they had to beat it. The realization hit every naval engineer with the same weight. If the Germans were using magnetism as a weapon, then magnetism itself had to become part of the U.S. Navy's defense. But that meant entering a field of physics few officers had ever studied beyond textbooks. And yet, within weeks, the first degaussing prototypes appeared in American shipyards. Degaussing, in principle, was simple. Reduce or alter a ship's magnetic field so that a German magnetic mine would not see it as a target. But the principle was the easy part. Turning that idea into a physical system, one that could be installed on destroyers, cruisers, tankers, and troopships, was something else entirely. The earliest attempts looked improvised, almost crude. Copper cables wrapped loosely around hulls. Makeshift power generators pulled from warehouses. Calibration done with handheld compasses that danced unpredictably near steel bulkheads. But with each test, with each explosion diagram sent from Britain, the engineers improved their designs. Shipyards became laboratories. Welders, electricians, physicists, and naval architects worked side by side. People who, under normal circumstances, might never have met. Now they were united by an urgent, invisible threat beneath the waterline. By late 1941, the effort accelerated into something extraordinary. Coils were redesigned to run along the entire length of a hull, hidden beneath protective panels. Specialized distribution boxes regulated the electrical current, creating a controlled magnetic counterfield. Each ship received a unique calibration profile, based on its steel composition, its mass, and even its history of service. No two vessels responded the same way. Testing was done in narrow harbors at dawn, when magnetic interference was lowest. Engineers stood on quiet piers with sensitive flux gate magnetometers, recording how a ship's magnetic footprint shifted with each adjustment of current. If the readings flattened enough, the ship passed. If not, the coils were rewired and tested again. What made the process even more complex was the sheer scale of demand. The United States, anticipating deeper involvement in the Atlantic, needed thousands of ships, combat vessels, merchant carriers, escort craft, protected as soon as possible. Degaussing became one of the largest emergency engineering programs the Navy had ever attempted. Some shipyard workers later recalled those nights. Bright floodlights, warm welders' sparks, and the constant smell of seawater mixed with hot copper insulation. They slept in short shifts, ate in the yards, and returned to the hulls before sunrise. Time wasn't just short, it was evaporating. But a turning point came when the first fully degaussed convoy departed the East Coast. Under escort, it navigated waters known to be seeded with magnetic mines. The tension on the bridge was palpable. Every hour felt like a test of theory against reality. And the ships made it through. All of them. The reports reached Washington with a tone that hadn't been heard in months. Confidence. The U.S. now had a working defense, imperfect, demanding, and resource-hungry, but real. The silent weapon the Germans had deployed was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was now a problem to counter, measure, and overcome. Still, there was a looming suspicion inside the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. The Germans had fielded this technology early in the war, which meant they likely had more advanced versions coming. And if the United States was going to stay ahead, understanding the original mine wasn't enough. They needed to predict the next one. Just as the United States began gaining confidence in its degaussing systems, new reports arrived from Britain that shattered any sense of safety. Mines were exploding again, this time under ships that had been fully degaussed, measured, and cleared. Something in the German arsenal had changed. These were not the mines recovered in 1940. These were new. The earliest clues came from the pattern of detonations. The triggers seemed sharper, more selective. Mines no longer reacted to basic magnetic distortions. Instead, they waited for specific signatures, unique combinations of field strength and rate of change. Engineers suspected the Germans had developed multi-coil sensors capable of reading a ship's passage with greater precision. The Americans understood the implication immediately. If the Germans had improved their sensors, the entire degaussing effort would need to evolve with it. At the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, the first response was analytical. Engineers laid out the internals of the original mine again, studying each coil, capacitor, and contact plate. They examined the sensitivity curves, the magnetic thresholds, the arming delays. Then they compared them to the new damage reports coming from the Atlantic. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. The explosions were occurring closer to the optimal point beneath a ship's keel. That level of precision meant the mines were detecting not just presence, but position. This implied the use of multi-axis magnetic sensing, a technology the U.S. had considered but never fully developed. The breakthrough came from a small British report. Divers had recovered fragments of a destroyed mine casing that contained remnants of a dual-coil assembly. The Germans were moving fast, too fast for comfort. This news hit Washington with the force of a cold wave. Suddenly, degaussing wasn't enough. Not on its own. The U.S. needed predictive countermeasures, systems that didn't just neutralize existing mines, but anticipated future enhancements. It was no longer a reaction, it was an arms race under the surface. Shipyards were given new instructions: expand coil systems, strengthen current control units, and introduce adjustable calibration modes. Degaussing became dynamic, rather than static. Merchant ships received simplified versions, while naval vessels were fitted with more advanced, tunable configurations. But the evolution didn't stop there. By late 1941, British intelligence intercepted German naval documents hinting at something even more serious: pressure fuses and acoustic triggers designed to work alongside magnetic systems. A mine that could listen for engine noise, or detect the change in water pressure as a ship passed overhead, represented a leap in complexity. If confirmed, it meant the Germans were blending multiple sensing technologies into a single weapon, creating what U.S. analysts began calling combined influence mines. And if the Germans succeeded, every defensive measure built so far would lose reliability overnight. American strategists now understood the nature of the threat. Germany wasn't simply ahead. It was moving ahead, faster than expected, adapting to countermeasures almost as soon as they appeared. Within the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, the tone shifted from urgency to controlled aggression. Engineers stopped discussing how to neutralize German technology and began focusing on how to surpass it. For the first time since the conflict began, American naval science wasn't just catching up. It was preparing to push past. But before they could do that, they needed to test their assumptions in real conditions. And that meant taking the fight out of the laboratory and into dangerous waters where the Germans had already laid their newest traps. The moment came when theory could no longer stand alone. American engineers, officers, and mine warfare specialists needed answers, and the only reliable answers lived out at sea, in waters already seeded with advanced German mines. Testing in controlled environments was no longer enough. If the Navy wanted to understand the new threat, it had to sail straight into it. The first ships chosen for the mission were modified fleet sweepers and destroyer escorts fitted with experimental degaussing coils, new calibration boxes, and reinforced hull sensors. Their decks bristled with equipment never intended for frontline duty: magnetic flux recorders, acoustic monitors, and cables thick with insulation. The vessels looked less like warships and more like floating laboratories. Their orders were blunt: enter high-risk channels, record every magnetic anomaly, and survive. On the morning of the first test run, a quiet unease filled the crew. Most of them understood the weapon they were trying to outsmart. A weapon that required no contact, no warning, no visible threat. A silent mine waited beneath the surface, listening, measuring, calculating. Compared to that, the men on deck felt painfully human. As the sweepers advanced through a known German minefield off the British coast, technicians inside the operations rooms watched their instruments with a kind of reverent focus. Needles trembled. Magnetic gradients shifted. Subtle spikes appeared on the display, ghost signatures of mines lying somewhere below. And then, for the first time, something remarkable happened. A spike surged, sharp and narrow, the unmistakable fingerprint of a nearby mine activating. But instead of detonating beneath the hull, the spike faded. The ship kept moving. The mine had seen them, yet failed to trigger. The degaussing system was working. But the celebration lasted only seconds. Another spike followed, this one higher, sharper, clearly from a more sensitive fuse. Again, the ship slipped past safely, but the readings told a different story. This mine had calibrated itself to respond to a tighter range of magnetic signatures. The German evolution was real. And it was happening fast. Over the next several hours, the sweepers recorded dozens of anomalies. Some mines reacted weakly, fooled by the altered field. Others activated dangerously close. A few barely registered. The data painted a complex picture. The Americans could counter the existing mines, but only barely, and only with perfect calibration. The real danger came at dusk. An escort destroyer running a parallel course reported a sudden drop in water pressure beneath its bow, a classic sign of a combined influence mine preparing to arm. Moments later, a low, muffled concussion echoed through the hull. The mine had detonated early, triggered by the ship's speed and acoustic profile rather than magnetism. This was the nightmare scenario. A weapon that ignored degaussing entirely. But even that blast, violent as it was, came too far ahead of the ship to cause serious damage. The Germans had perfected the concept, but not the deployment. The Americans still had time. Back at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, the test results were received like intelligence from a new front. Engineers pored over the magnetic gradient curves, the activation spikes, the pressure drop records. The data proved something critical. America didn't need to outmatch every German innovation. It needed systems flexible enough to adapt to all of them, magnetic, acoustic, and pressure-based. The shift in mindset was immediate. Degaussing was no longer a static defense. It would become part of a layered countermeasure strategy, one that could meet the Germans on the same technological plane. Ships would need integrated sensors, faster calibration tools, and dynamic magnetic control systems. And they would need them quickly. For the first time, U.S. naval engineers felt something new. Not fear, not uncertainty, but momentum. They finally had the data they needed to fight back with precision. The silent weapon was still evolving. But now, the American response was evolving too. By early 1942, something had shifted inside the U.S. Navy. What began as a desperate effort to understand an unfamiliar weapon had transformed into a sustained scientific campaign. Laboratories, shipyards, and fleet commands were no longer reacting to German innovation, they were anticipating it. The data gathered from real minefields changed everything. Engineers finally understood how sensitive the new German fuses were, how quickly they adjusted to environmental conditions, and how they layered magnetic, acoustic, and pressure triggers into a single, lethal package. But for every new German improvement, American analysts found a vulnerability, sometimes small, sometimes fleeting, but always real. And from these vulnerabilities came solutions. Ships began receiving multi-loop degaussing coils, each controlled by adjustable current regulators that allowed crews to tune their magnetic signature on demand. New training programs taught sailors how to monitor their fields, how to recalibrate after long voyages, and how to detect subtle changes that might reveal a mine nearby. At the same time, American scientists introduced acoustic countermeasures, noise generators that masked a ship's engine signature or mimicked smaller, less attractive targets. Pressure-based defenses followed, changes in ballast routines, modified hull profiles, and experimental devices intended to disrupt the underwater pressure waves mines depended on. None of these measures were perfect. But together, they formed a layered shield, flexible where German designs were rigid, adaptable where German engineering aimed for precision. The silent battlefield beneath the waves was becoming a place where American ingenuity could finally breathe. In British ports, the effects were already visible. Convoys that once arrived with gaps, ships missing from formation, crews lost without warning, now steamed in with their hulls intact. Mines still lurked beneath the surface, but the ships no longer sailed blind. The quiet fear that had haunted harbor entrances began to fade. By mid-1942, American officers visiting British bases could see the difference in the faces of sailors. Not relief, war never allowed that, but a grounded confidence. A sense that the invisible threat was no longer invincible. Across the Atlantic, the mine warfare divisions of the U.S. Navy expanded rapidly. New research wings were established. Partnerships with universities formed. Contracts poured into industrial firms to build coils, magnetometers, and calibration equipment at a scale that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier. The Germans continued to innovate, introducing more sensitive fuses and more complex sensing patterns. But each time, the Americans responded faster than before. The gap that once felt like a chasm was narrowing. And eventually, it closed. By the time the United States was fully engaged in the Atlantic War, degaussing and influence protection had become standard procedures, so routine that young sailors treated the technology as if it had always existed. To them, the silent weapon was just another threat among many. But to the engineers who remembered those early months, the uncertainty, the rushed experiments, the nights spent bending copper and tracing magnetic lines by hand, the victory was deeper than tactical success. It was proof that science, discipline, and collaboration could defeat even the most advanced weapon of its time. In the end, the German magnetic mine never disappeared. It continued to evolve, and it remained deadly. But it no longer shaped the course of the war. It no longer dictated where ships could sail or how convoys moved. It no longer held the advantage of surprise. The silent weapon that once terrified the Atlantic had become a known quantity, an adversary understood, measured, and contained. And in that transformation, the U.S. Navy learned one of the most important lessons of the war. In a world of invisible threats, knowledge is armor, and engineering is a weapon of its own.